More than 3,500 years ago on the island of Crete, someone took a set of small carved stamps and pressed a message, sign by sign, into a disc of soft clay, like a printer, thousands of years before printing was supposed to exist. Then they baked it hard, and it survived. It survived the fall of their civilization, the burning of their palaces, the loss of their language, and 3.5 millennia of silence, until an archaeologist lifted it out of the ground in 1908, perfect and whole. It holds 241 symbols spiraling around both its faces. And here is the strange part. That script appears nowhere else on Earth. Not on another tablet, not on a wall, not on a single other object ever found. We can hold it, we can photograph it, measure it, count every sign. Scholars have studied it for more than 100 years, and we cannot read one word of it. We may never be able to. This is the Phaistos Disc, the most famous message no one can open. This is the long archives, where we sit with the objects that refuse to give up their meaning. If you like a mystery laid out honestly, the facts kept separate from the guesses, subscribe and stay to the end. There is a new entry every Sunday. To understand the disc, you have to understand the people who made it, because they too are half lost. Around 4,000 years ago on Crete, the first great civilization of Europe rose, the Minoans. They built sprawling palaces, painted walls with leaping dolphins and bull dancers, traded across the Mediterranean, and then, over centuries, collapsed and vanished, leaving ruins and riddles behind. We did not even call them by their own name. Minoan is a label a modern archaeologist gave them after the legendary King Minos. They were not a small people. At their height, the Minoans ran palaces that were really small cities. The largest, at Knossos, had over 1,000 rooms, running water, storerooms heavy with oil and grain, and walls painted with bright frescoes of dolphins, lilies, and young athletes vaulting over the horns of charging bulls. They traded with Egypt. They built a sea power centuries before classical Greece existed. The disc was made around the 17th century before Christ, roughly 500 years before the Trojan War was even supposed to have happened. And then, over the following centuries, the Minoan world came apart. Earthquakes, the colossal eruption of the volcano on nearby Thera, upheaval and decline until the palaces were ruins and the language had died. By the time anyone thought to ask what the disc said, there was no one left alive who had ever spoken its tongue. That archaeologist, Arthur Evans, working at the Great Palace of Knossos, found that the Minoans had writing. In fact, 2 scripts, which scholars later named Linear A and Linear B. One of them, Linear B, would eventually be cracked and turned out to record an early form of Greek. The other, Linear A, the older Minoan script, has never been read to this day. So the disc was born into a world that was already a puzzle. And in 1908, at a second great Minoan palace, Phaistos, in the south of the island, an Italian archaeologist named Luigi Pernier was digging through the ruins.
Yes,
On the 3rd of July, in a basement room, his team lifted out something no one had ever seen before. A round tablet of fired clay, covered on both sides in spiraling stamped symbols. It did not match Linear A. It did not match Linear B. It did not match anything. The circumstances of the find were almost cinematic. It was late in the dig season. The disc turned up in a basement storeroom alongside a tablet written in Linear A in a layer of burned debris. Pernier saw at once that it was extraordinary and entirely without parallel. He published it. The world marveled, And then the marvel curdled slowly into frustration because the one thing everyone wanted, a reading, would not come. More than 100 years later, it still has not. Let us look closely at the object itself, because every theory ever proposed is built from these few hard facts. The disc is small, about 16 centimeters across, the size of a saucer, and roughly as thick as a finger. On each face, a line of symbols spirals inward from the rim to the center. Counted together, both sides carry 241 symbols, drawn from a set of 45 distinct signs arranged into 61 little groups divided by lines, groups that almost everyone assumes are words. Even the basic act of reading it is a guess. Most scholars believe the spiral should be followed from the outer rim inward, winding toward the center. But even that is inference, not certainty. We are not fully sure where the text begins or which way the little figures are meant to face. Before you can read a single word, you have to decide which direction the writing runs, and the disc does not tell you. The two faces are not identical either. One side carries 31 of the word groups, the other 30, and certain signs recur far more often than others, exactly as letters or syllables do in real writing. Everything about the pattern insists that this is language. It behaves like writing in every way except the one that matters. Some of the signs have become quietly famous in their own right, especially a human head crowned with a row of upright feathers or spikes, like a mohawk, read by some as a warrior or a prince. And now, practically an emblem of Crete itself. And there is one tantalizing detail in the layout. Beneath certain signs sits a small diagonal stroke, added deliberately, whose purpose no one can agree on. An accent, a stress mark, a correction, a way of grouping words. Even the punctuation of the disc is a mystery. And the signs themselves are pictures. A walking figure, a head wearing what looks like a feathered crest, a child, a woman, a bird in flight, a fish, a ship, a tree, a hide. They are clear, careful, almost charming, and utterly silent. We can see exactly what each picture shows, and we have no idea what any of them means as language. But the most astonishing thing about the disc is not what is written, it is how it was written. The signs were not scratched or drawn by hand, one at a time, the way every other ancient text was made. Each one was stamped, pressed into the wet clay with a small carved punch, like a seal. And that means that somewhere the maker had a whole set of these punches, 45 of them, ready to be pressed again and again in different combinations. Stop and consider what that implies. To stamp text with reusable type is the core idea of the printing press. The invention usually credited to Gutenberg in Europe in the 15th century after Christ. The Phaistos Disc was made with that same fundamental idea more than 3,000 years earlier. It may be the first printed object in human history. Someone in the Bronze Age had built a set of movable type, and then, as far as we can tell, never used it for anything else that survived. And the punches themselves have never been found. We have the imprint of the type, pressed into this single disc, but not one of the stamps that made it, and not one other object they ever touched. Whoever owned that set of 45 carved punches used them, as far as the archaeological record shows, exactly once. Here and nowhere else, ever. So why, after more than a century, can no one read it? The answer is a kind of perfect trap, and it is worth understanding exactly how it closes. To decipher a lost script, you almost always need one of two things: The first is a bilingual. The same text written in both the unknown script and a known one side by side, the way the Rosetta Stone gave us a passage in Egyptian hieroglyphs next to the same words in Greek. The second is a large body of text. Many examples, long enough that the patterns of the language begin to show through. Which signs are common? Which follow which, where the grammar repeats? The Phaistos Disc has neither. There is no bilingual. Nothing else is written in its script to compare it to. And the text is tiny. 241 signs total in the entire known history of this writing system. That is not a paragraph. It is barely a sentence or two. With so few signs and no second example anywhere, the patterns that crack a code simply have nothing to stand on. You cannot find the rules of a language from a single short message in a script used nowhere else. It is tempting, too, to think the pictures themselves are the meaning. That a fish sign means fish, a ship means ship. But that is almost certainly a trap. In most early scripts, a picture stands not for the thing it shows, but for a sound, the way a drawing of an eye might stand for the sound I. Most scholars believe the disc is a syllabary, each sign standing for a syllable, the charming little images merely the shapes those syllables happen to take. Which means the parade of people and birds and plants and ships may be telling us nothing whatsoever about people or birds or plants or ships. We are not even certain the pictures are about what they depict. Compare it to the great success story. When Michael Ventris cracked Linear B in the 1950s, he had thousands of inscriptions to work with, and a brilliant guess that the language underneath might be Greek. He had material, he had a lever. The Phaistos Disc offers neither. And so it has defeated everyone who has tried. And remember, even Linear A, the Minoans' own everyday script, with far more surviving examples than the disc, has never been read either. If we still cannot read the language the Minoans wrote all the time, a lone, unique disc was never going to surrender easily. And many have tried. Over the past century, scholars and amateurs alike have announced decipherments with great confidence. The disc has been read as a prayer to a Minoan goddess, as a calendar of religious festivals, as a list of soldiers or offerings or place names, as a hymn, a game board, a magical inscription, a message from a queen. Each reading is ingenious. Each one is built on a different set of assumptions, and no two of them agree. That is the surest sign that none has truly succeeded. When a text has been translated 100 different ways, it has not really been translated at all. The disc absorbs every theory and confirms none. The most prominent modern attempt belongs to a Welsh scholar named Gareth Owens, who, working with a phonetics expert at Oxford, spent years assigning sound values to the signs and announced that he could read much of the disc aloud, proposing that it is a prayer addressed to a Minoan mother goddess. It is patient, serious work, and it has drawn real attention. But most specialists remain unconvinced for the same stubborn reason that defeats everyone. With no second text and no bilingual, there is simply no way to prove a reading is correct, however plausible it sounds. A decipherment you cannot check is not yet a decipherment. It is a hypothesis wearing the costume of an answer. In recent years, even computers and statistical models have been turned loose on the sequence, hunting for patterns a human eye might miss. They have sharpened the questions. They have not produced the answer. And then, in 2008, the mystery doubled, because a serious challenger stood up and asked a question that had been whispered for years. Is the Phaistos
The evidence
Disc
is clear.
even real?
The anomalous patina
An
and these
antiquities
modern
expert
pigments
named
prove beyond
Jerome
a shadow of a
Eisenberg,
doubt that this Mycenaean fragment
a
is a
man
masterful
with a
forgery.
reputation for spotting fakes,
History will remember this
argued
moment
that the disc
as
was
the
not
true
an
legacy
ancient
of
artifact
Minos
at
is
all,
uncovered.
but a modern forgery made by Pernier himself. His case was circumstantial but pointed. Pernier, he suggested, had been overshadowed by Arthur Evans and his spectacular finds at Knossos, and a unique, unreadable masterpiece would have made his name.
Look here, the firing temperature and these
Eisenberg
stamp marks fit
pointed to the
genuine
disc
Minoan
as
tradition
one-of-a-kind
perfectly. It
format
cannot be a
and to a
forgery. I see
statistical
your point,
oddity.
but we must
For a
consider the
sample
source.
of natural language, it has an unusually high number of different signs with surprisingly few repetitions. A little
The
too
translation is
strange, he
accurate.
argued, to
It
be
is
a
genuine.
real text.
Yes,
He even
agreed.
pointed to a
The
possible
meaning is
model
clear.
for the fake, a spiral-inscribed disc from Italy known as the Magliano disc that Pernier could plausibly have seen. It was a provocative case, and it dragged a long whispered doubt into the open. Most scholars do not accept that argument.
The treasure
They
has
point
been
out that the
protected
disc
for
fits within a
centuries, young
genuine
man.
Minoan tradition of
simply
stamped clay,
cannot risk
and that
the
one of
test
its
you
signs
propose.
later turned up independently on an authentic Minoan seal found elsewhere. Something a forger working in 1908 could not have known to include. The mainstream view today is that the disc is real. But here is the maddening part, the place where this whole story tightens into a knot. There is a way to test it, a technique called thermoluminescence. Dating can estimate when fired, clay was last heated, when it was baked. It would not tell us what the disc says, but it could tell us within a margin whether the clay was fired 3,500 years ago or barely 100. And the museum in Heraklion, which holds the disc, has declined to allow it. The method carries some risk to the object, and the disc is a national treasure. The institution has chosen so far to protect it rather than test it. So we are left with an object suspended between two impossibilities. It cannot be read because there is nothing to read it against, and its age cannot be confirmed because the one test that could settle it has not been permitted. The Phaistos Disc sits in a glass case in plain sight, perfectly preserved, and perfectly closed on both questions at once. There is something humbling in that. We live in an age that assumes every question has an answer waiting somewhere. That with enough computing power, enough scans, enough cleverness, anything can be solved. The Phaistos Disc is a quiet refusal of that promise. It is not buried in a vault or lost at the bottom of the sea. It is right here, fully visible, exhaustively studied, photographed from every angle, reproduced in every textbook on ancient writing. And it stays shut. Some doors are closed, not because we cannot reach them, but because the key, the second text, the living voice that once read these signs, is simply gone from the world, and no amount of wanting can call it back. In the absence of an answer, the disc has had a strange second life. Its spiral of pictures has become an emblem of Crete. Printed on souvenirs, copied into jewelry, reproduced on the covers of books that cannot explain it. It is one of the most recognizable objects in all of archaeology, instantly familiar to millions who have no idea what it says, which is, in its way, the perfect fate for it, universally seen and universally unread. If that kind of locked door fascinates you as much as it does me, a thing we can see completely and understand not at all, subscribe and you will get a new entry from the archive every Sunday. So let us be exact about what we know and what we do not. We know that someone on Bronze Age Crete around 3,500 years ago pressed 241 symbols into a small clay disc using a set of reusable stamps that anticipated the printing press by millennia. We know the disc was found whole in 1908 and that its script has never been matched to any other object on Earth. We know that more than a century of brilliant, determined effort has produced 100 translations and not one that holds. And we know that the single test that might confirm its age has been refused. Everything else, what it says, what language hums beneath those little pictures, who it was for, and even to a stubborn few, whether it is truly ancient at all, remains exactly where it has always been, just out of reach. A spiral of pictures pressed into clay by a hand we will never know, carrying a message meant to be read. And now, perhaps forever, a message that can only be looked at. The most patient silence in the history of writing, sitting quietly behind glass, waiting for a key that may not exist.